In Dorothy and Thomas Hoobler's latest book, they open with this introduction. This is a book of love letters. Every one of them involved a president of the United States, and we will tell you their stories through the letters they wrote. The Hooblers continued. Through this collection of carefully chosen letters, we reveal the writers at their most vulnerable, providing a surprisingly intimate and deeply personal portrait that is often obscured by the public persona. Dorothy and Thomas Hoobler's book is titled, Are You Prepared for the Storm of Lovemaking?
Hi there, I'm Jonathan from C-SPAN, along with my colleague, Ben. Since C-SPAN's founding 45 years ago, the media world has changed. Remember when there were just a few TV channels? Now we've got streaming, social media, apps, and more.
Through all of this, C-SPAN has stayed true to its mission of giving you unfiltered access to government wherever you get your news. As we navigate this challenging media environment with fewer people subscribing to traditional cable packages, our funding has been impacted.
That's why we're asking for your help to keep going strong for another 45 years. Please donate today at cspan.org/donate. Your contribution, large or small, helps ensure at least another 45 years of witnessing democracy in action.
Keep C-SPAN thriving in today's ever-changing media landscape. Visit cspan.org/donate to make your gift today. Thank you.
Dorothy Hoobler, did you ever write a love letter to your husband who's sitting right next to you, Thomas?
No. No. We met in New York, and it was never necessary.
Where did you get the idea to do the love letters and other letters of the president to their wives?
I think Tom should answer that one. He got the idea.
Well, you're surfing the net and, idly looking at something that might interest you. And I saw this, it's the Richard Nixon Library had put up some letters that Richard Nixon had written to Pat when they were courting. And I was astonished, really, to find that it was like Richard Nixon wrote this, because it's very sweet and thoughtful, and not at all like the Richard Nixon that people think they know from wherever they get their information. And so, I just sort of tucked that away. And then a few days later, it wasn't that long, I saw the similar thing for Lyndon Johnson and Lady Bird Johnson, except that in that case, Lyndon was his old self. He's twisting arms. He's demanding that she write him every day. He's writing little notes on top of the letter and saying, who do you love? When are we going to get married? And all of this. This is like within weeks of their actually meeting. So I thought, this is interesting. I wonder if there are more letters by presidents to their beloveds. And that was the beginning of the project.
Dorothy, what do you take away from spending all this time with these letters?
Well, I thought it was a fascinating way to look at people, because it's interesting to see some people have many facets and others are much more the same publicly and privately. I think the Nixon letters, I do think that the Nixon letters are among the nicest in the book. But I had once seen something years ago, which was interesting to me, that I forget now who the person was. It was back in the 70s. But his daughter had died. He was a newspaper person, and he, in fact, spent much of his career attacking Nixon. But he said, I think his daughter had committed suicide, and he said the nicest letter he got was from Nixon, which I thought was astonishing, So you started to see that there are sorts of different kinds of things. And then in the letters of presidents, you find out all sorts of interesting nuggets, not just the romance. But when John Tyler was writing to his first wife, he has a great. He witnessed the attempted assassination of Jackson. He describes it quite well. I mean, it's a very open and I thought really first-rate um, observation on it. And there's just all sorts of things of who knew each other, different kinds of things you only get from personal letters when people are not on the stage, when they're not in front of everybody. So that was one of the things that, and also I was a history major, so of course I thought you learn a lot of stuff from first person accounts give you very interesting information.
I went through some of the letters and wrote down what they called their wives. And I'm just going to quickly go down the list and get your reaction to this. Theodore Roosevelt wrote to his young wife, Alice, called her darling wife. Benjamin Harrison, my dear wife. Chester Arthur, my dearest Nell. Rutherford B. Hayes, my darling. My love, said Andrew Jackson to Rachel. My dearest friend, John Adams, to Abigail. My dear Diana, which I'll ask you about in one of the letters. Dearest heart, Dick Nixon to Pat. My dear Grace, Calvin Coolidge. Dear Bessie or Bess. And the ones that really I thought, and I know you know this story, were the two wives and girlfriend of Woodrow Wilson. He addressed his second wife, Edith, my own precious darling, my adorable sweetheart, and then his first wife who died, my own darling. What do you make of these kind of way that they introduced themselves to their wives through these letters?
I immediately thought of some letters that we weren't given permission to use, and I really was unhappy about that. The letters from Ronald Reagan to Nancy, she collected these letters, she saved them, and she put them together in a book, which she published. So she obviously thought that these were flattering letters, and she's dead and he's dead, and the something called the foundation, the Ronald Reagan Foundation, owns the copyright to them now. And most people were pretty cooperative when they heard about our project, and but not them. They didn't want anything to do with that, and they refused to give us permission. Now that the way he addressed her was very different from the ones that you just cited. Now let me think.
Mommy.
Oh yeah, mommy poo poo. That was one. That it was that kind of baby talk sort of thing in those letters. So you won't find those in our book, unfortunately. And as a matter of fact, they show Reagan to be a very thoughtful person.
And a good writer.
And a good writer, yes. Yeah, it was just, I think, I don't know, they didn't cite any reason at the foundation why they wouldn't let us have they said, well, there's already a book. Well, yeah, that was true, but we weren't trying to reproduce the entire book. But I think it was the mommy poo-poo. They're trying to clean up his image. That's my speculation, so you can't quote me. Go, what were you going to say?
No, I was going to say about the Wilsons. I was particularly fascinated by the Wilson because when I was in high school, a long, long time ago, we spent a half a semester on Woodrow Wilson and how serious he was, and he was constantly doing this work. But doing this, we found out he was thousands. He literally wrote thousands of pages of letters to his wife and his wives and mistress, and they weren't short letters. They went on and on, and remember they're handwritten. No typewriters at that time. How he had time to do all of this. Then you started to see with the second wife when he's meeting her and courting her and spending all this time. This is when World War I was on in Europe, and you have the bombing of the Lusitania, and people are wondering what's going on in the White House because he clearly was spending an awful lot of time on these women on courting Edith. So that was to me that was sort of strange because you don't think of Wilson as being a particularly highly sexual man, but he very clearly was.
I'll read a little bit here of the letter
Yes.
from 6 February 1894 to his first wife, Ellen. My own darling, when you get back, you'll smother me, will you? My sweet little lover, and what will I be doing all the while? Simply submitting to be smothered. Do you think you can stand the innumerable kisses and the passionate embraces you will receive? Are you prepared for, and this is where your book title comes from, are you prepared for the storm of lovemaking with which you will be assailed? And why did you decide to call your book, as I just read there, Are You Prepared for the Storm of Lovemaking?
The publisher.
I have to confess, we had a rather more bland title. We were calling it Presidents in Love, but when it went through the mill at the publisher, somebody, I don't know who, maybe our editor, but they had a meeting and somebody noticed the same thing you did, that passage from Wilson, and they decided, well, they sort of asked us, but when your publisher asks you about something like that, and unless you have very strong feelings, opposite feelings, you let them do it. And it seems like it was a success in that sense because people noticed that title came from Wilson.
I hate
And
that.
that,
Go ahead. Go ahead, Dorothy.
no, I was going to say, and that passage came after almost 10 years of marriage. So
Yeah.
it's not like this ardent young man just married. It's clear that this was the sort of person he was throughout his life. So
In private.
in private, yes. And in fact, the mistress that he wrote to in Bermuda, when she heard the first wife had died, she was thinking that she might be, the next first lady in the White House. She was horrified when she found out that he'd met somebody else very soon afterwards and chose her instead. But
When Theodore Roosevelt was running against Wilson, this was in the three-way race that let Wilson become president because the Republican vote was split between Taft and Theodore Roosevelt. Someone someone in the Roosevelt camp found out about the mistress in the Bahamas, I guess, and said maybe we can use this against him. And Roosevelt is supposed to have said, "Don't bother. Nobody would believe it. He's perfectly cast as the apothecary's assistant." So
Warren Harding, of course, gets attention, and you publish a poem by his mistress. Why did you do that?
it was his poem. He was
yeah,
writing to the mistress, and well, I mean, he was another person that seemed to have a lot of time on his hands for writing very, very long letters.
Very
They
long.
went on and on and on and on and on for pages. So he actually, some of this, I guess, could have been, he could have been writing for the porn industry almost because he really just somehow just brought it out all the time.
the
But
poem is it's a bit milder. There's only really one or two places in the Harding canon.
Dorothy,
Where
do you
we-
have it there?
oh yes, absolutely.
Why don't you
Here,
read a
Tom,
little
why don't
bit?
you- why
Read a
don't
little bit
You
of
want
it.
us to read it?
Yes,
Yeah,
you
sure.
read that.
Okay. I love your poise of perfect thighs when they hold me in paradise. I love the rose your garden grows, love seashell pink that over it glows. I love to suck your breath away. I love to cling there, long to stay. I love you garbed but naked more. Love your beauty to thus adore. I love you when you open eyes and mouth and arms and cradling thighs. If I had you today, I'd kiss and fondle you into my arms and hold you there until you said, Warren, oh Warren, in a benediction of blissful joy.
You also talk about he had a habit in his writing of referring to their private parts, as you would say.
Yeah.
One was Jerry, and the other was Mrs. Powderson.
That's right.
And where did you find this?
There's actually a document in the Harding papers in the Library of Congress. There are more
More of the letter.
substitute things because he was, even though he had cautioned his that particular mistress to burn, throw out, whatever, get rid of all these letters, she didn't do it, and so he had devised this code. Jerry and Mrs. Powderson are two of the words in the code, but there is a sheet on which he has many such substitute words.
So, Dorothy, what did you also learn after you spent all this time with the presidents? What were some of the things that come to mind?
Well, I learned little bits and pieces, but I think I learned that actually Grant was a very good writer. He wrote good letters, and I think he probably wrote most of the book, not just Mark Twain.
His book, yeah.
His biography. I think it's interesting how some of the people who, at least politically, wrote very fine letters. Their personal ones, certainly John Kennedy was nothing much of a letter writer and certainly had no sentimentality to him at all. Jefferson was the one exception. I think he wrote beautifully both ways, because the one where he writes to the woman he met in France, where he talks about wishing he were a bird. There's a certain amount of just beauty in speech that Jefferson had, I guess, for both politics and both personal things. But Madison's are sort of, But I also found charming too Calvin Coolidge, because we say in there they're not really love letters, but they are, because they're sort of what he was. He was a depressive person, and he was lucky to meet Grace, because everybody said she was a lovely, lovely human being. Everybody liked her. She was funny and nice. Her mother said, "Don't marry this guy because he's just, But they are, you can see there the only way he could express love. And it was sad, because we read that when he was president, his son died, one of his sons died, and he never recovered from that. He literally shut down totally, and evidently did almost nothing else for the rest of his presidency. He just virtually sat in the
that
office.
was the reason when they were wondering whether he would run again, since he was eligible, and he said, "I do not choose to run," and that was all he would say about that. The mother, by the way, later on, this is Grace's mother, said, "Well, it was Grace that made him the president." She took her daughter's credit for the fact that, and maybe she was right. Although, as you probably know, what's his name?
Coolidge.
Coolidge was governor of Massachusetts before he became president, so it wasn't like he was forced into politics. He was.
No, he liked politics. He liked politics a lot, but he seemed to not have in any way, the personality for it. He's just an odd bird in everywhere. He even had odd pets, raccoons, weird, animals in the White House. But she was a delight. Everybody liked her. After all, she spent the rest of her life working with the deaf. She was just a first-rate human being in every way, and she was funny and nice. And I think she probably, saved him for the years afterwards, because he didn't have any of that sort of personality. But he was devoted to her.
What was the story about how she saw him in the window across the street from where she used to live before they were married?
Yeah, well, she was teaching in, as Dorothy said, the school for the deaf, and he was staying in some kind of apartment house across the way, and she happened to look, I guess, through his window, not close up. She wasn't intending to, but he was shaving. He was wearing what they called at that time a union suit, which is a kind of an all-over underwear, and he was wearing a derby hat. That's what caught her eye. He was wearing a derby hat while he was shaving. So she made his acquaintance by sending a plant to him through the janitor in the building. And when they met, she brought up the subject, and he said, "Well, the hat, I wear a derby when I'm shaving so that my hair doesn't fall into my face." He thought that was perfectly logical. And
When you all did your research, you found, at least you tell us in here, I don't know, I've read at least a half dozen times, this letter has never been published before.
some of them,
Well, how did that happen that it had never been published?
Well, they hadn't been published in books or whatever. That was
yeah.
it. It was that, it's not obviously if they never we couldn't have found them if there wasn't some sort of publication, but they were
Well, many
yeah,
of them were taken from the archives
yeah, yeah,
in like presidential libraries and so forth.
yeah.
There are some, you can't say that, I don't believe, about any of the Wilson letters. There's something like 25 volumes published by a university press that have published those. But the ones that weren't published were just, this is the first time they appeared in print.
You say that John Adams and Abigail Adams exchanged 1,100 letters.
Yes,
Where are
yes.
those to be seen?
Many of them are in the Massachusetts Historical Society, and they, well, both of them love to write letters, and those letters are really the most varied, I would say, of all of the letters. One of the things, one of the things about the presidential letters, there's some are obviously much better than others. Some are better writers or funnier or whatever, but obviously both Abigail and John were very literate, and so some are playful, some are more factual, some are very romantic. It's a very wide selection, but they were separated a lot. You had to be separated a lot after all to write the letters. So, although one of the funny things about Calvin and and Grace was the fact that she was just next door, and he still wrote to her. He wrote to her to ask her whether they should meet or whatever, and they were just right next door. But he would say, that if I don't hear from you, I'll show up. And it
That's
was
right.
just, that's the way they were abrupt, but I think they did represent very deep feelings and the deepest feelings that he had.
What was that passage you were quoting to me today about from the Adamses? He said something about the pleasure he got from writing her. Remember that?
Oh, yes. He said that
That-
writing letters is one of my favorite pleasures. And writing letters to Abigail is my favorite pleasure of the writing letters. So
Right.
it was very clear
There,
that
maybe
he
that's it.
no, it was
No?
earlier. No, it was, he said, the direct quote is, "Now letter writing is to me the most agreeable amusement, and writing to you the most entertaining and agreeable of all letter writing."
How long?
So they were separated sometimes for quite a long period of time, and she was a more avid writer as the years went by than he was.
Yeah, he spent time in Europe acting as a diplomat for the United States. And
How
of course,
how did you two? How do you two work together? And how long have you worked together?
Well, we've been writing books since what, 1973, I think, independently. So that's a long time. Well,
I don't know. Well, people people are sometimes ask us that question in a more rude phrasing. They say, "How do you write so many books together and stay married?" But
And you two,
even though we have some dif disagreements,
yeah, it just
that's only natural. You no more than I think somebody who is working in an office.
well, it is. There's a certain amount of back and forth, and you get annoyed about some things, but the project gets finished. And being the fact that we were independent researchers and independent
Authors.
authors meant that you had to write on all sorts of subjects. The thing was to get a project, so we've written on many different subjects.
What's
So
been your most success of all the
This one,
this one,
this
and
one?
102 was the charm that we say.
That's 102 books.
Yeah,
yeah.
published books. Yeah.
So what were the, give me the categories of the other books.
Well, a lot of them were nonfiction history. We did a 10-part series for Oxford University Press on different ethnic groups called the American Family Album. That was, again, first-person accounts. We did many biographies. The series on Japanese detective. This was mainly Tom, but it was it was a mystery series, not fiction.
Yeah,
And
don't forget, some of these and a great many of these were for young
young
readers,
adults. Yeah.
young adults they called them. We won an Edgar for the um, stories about the boy who helps his foster father solve crimes. The foster father is Judge Oka in Japan. He's a real person. He was actually lived, and it was known for his or his
Ability.
crime solving. Um,
Yeah, the judges in both China and Japan were investigators as well. It was a different kind of role. So he was famous too for solving crime. So we used him as a backstop, but the
but our
boy was
main
made up and
character
then
was a
made
made-up
up. Yeah.
teenager.
And it's set in 18th century Japan. So
As you went about writing this book and doing your research, what letter was the strangest, not the strangest letter so much as the strangest place that you found it?
we just placed it.
Strangest place.
And how hard was it to find some of these letters? And where did you?
Well, um, well, one of the strange places, I think the only letter that we found that was gotten through somebody buying it in an auction was
Oh,
the
yeah.
letter
The
that
Kennedy
John
letter.
Kennedy sent to Mary Pinchet Meyer. And this one, I actually, the first title for the book was going to be why don't you just say yes, which is the end of it. I'll just read it. It's very short because all of the things that um, um, Kennedy wrote to women were short. But
First,
anyway,
Dorothy, first tell us who Mary Meyer was.
oh yes, Mary Pinchet Meyer, excuse me, was formerly married to Cord Meyer, who was very high up in the CIA. She was also the sister of Antoinette Meyer, who was the first wife of Ben Bradley of the Washington Post. So she had they had double dated. The Kennedys and the Bradleys were very, close friends. But later on, she took up with Kennedy, and it certainly was rumored that they took LSD together, that they were close. It was a different relationship than certainly some of the ones he had with other women.
This wasn't an open relationship. It was surreptitious, right?
Well,
He
pretty
didn't.
much.
When you say they went out together, they didn't do it.
Well, I would say medium. Medium. I think some people knew about it in
Oh,
Washington.
sure, in Washington, yeah.
But she wasn't like a B girl or anything of that sort. She was Vassar graduate. She was part of a whole group of Washington women that were quite powerful and married to powerful men. And she was also, if you remember, she was killed about a year after the Kennedy assassination. And it was a very strange murder that was never solved. She was shot to death in the park in Washington.
And when
But
Kennedy was assassinated, the first two people, at least as far as anybody knows, who arrived at his home were Ben Bradley and
no, you mean when after Mary Cord was assassinated.
oh, after she was assassinated.
Yes,
Yeah,
after she
right.
was assassinated.
That's right.
Ben Bradley, also James Angleton, rushed to
Of the
apartment. Yeah.
CIA.
There's different, but whatever, it was something that unsolved to this day. But this was a handwritten note which was found in the files of Evelyn Lincoln, his JFK's secretary, after her death, and it was apparently never sent. But it says, "Why don't you leave suburbia for once? Come and see me either here or at the Cape next week or in Boston the 19th. I know it's unwise, irrational, and that you may hate it. On the other hand, you may not, and I will love it. You say that it is good for me not to get what I want. After all of these years, you should give me a more loving answer than that. Why don't you just say yes? I thought it was interesting. It's an interesting letter.
And you,
It's not known whether she said yes.
Well, I
and
mean,
and you end the book that way.
yeah, well, because that was the last section and he was the last person. I mean, obviously, there were more things. For example, everybody knows that LBJ had lots of women, but we couldn't find some of those letters. I think they were destroyed. I forget what her, Alice something or other, for years, he had an affair with her. And, but they just weren't available. I mean, some people did, after all, destroy their letters, which makes some sense, you know.
I think it was Alice Glass.
Pardon?
I said
Yeah,
I think
I
it
was-
was Alice Glass who he had the
Yes, that's right. It's
reported
Alice
affair.
Glass. Absolutely, yes. And that's amazing because it was sort of gutsy because she was originally the mistress of the owner of that newspaper, which who had helped his career. Was it the Houston? I forget what Texas paper, but that's how he met her originally. But
Oh,
anyway,
I want you to go to page 208 in your book, and this is a letter from 1862. Would have been right in the middle of the Civil War. It was from James Garfield to his wife, and he starts. I found this to be the most interesting letter in the book for only one reason, and that
oh
was
yeah, yes, but
how he took on his wife in this letter.
oh, absolutely. You're talking about when he talks about meeting the other woman and how is this the one where he's
He says, I've taken this new sheet to say a few words in regard to ourselves. I know you want me to be frank in everything. And
Yes.
you can pick up from there if you want. So I think that one's worth talking about.
Yes, that probably was what I would say was the most modern marriage in some kind of ways. It was two conflicted people. Um, I've taken this new sheet to say a few words in regard to ourselves. I know you want me to be frank in everything, and I want to assure and reassure you that I write what follows with the tenderest regards for our mutual happiness. In your letter, which now lies before me, there's the following passage. Jamie, I should not blame my own heart if it lost all faith in you. I hope it may not. Indeed, I'm not going to let it, but I need not be forever telling you I love you when there is evidently no more desire for it on your part than present manifestations indicate. I had to read that sentence over several times before I could become fully convinced that you have written the passage which I have underscored. Waiving the consideration out of which this sentence arose, my letters to you, their relative brevity and infrequency, for I've spoken of that in my last letter, which you've received before this. I want you to look at your words again
And ask
and
yourself.
ask yourself whether you ought to have written them to me.
Where did you,
Now-
can you remember where you found this one?
Oh my goodness, we must have it. You have the book with the
There's a book of their letters
Yeah.
that was written or collected by, I've forgotten her name, but it's in our bibliography, I'm sure. And Crete, you see, that's the way he referred to her
Lucretia, yeah.
affectionately. Her name was Lucretia, my dear Crete. And I think my dear Crete may have been the, what
Yes, and there is, by the way, supposedly, I think this year coming out a new book on the Garfields because he turns out to be another very interesting human being himself. Garfield was the first that we know was a left-handed president. Now, there may have been some earlier and it just wasn't known. But now we find out afterwards there are many, disproportionately number of left-handers. But what was interesting about him was that he could write with both left and right hands at the same time. And they did say that he could write in both Latin and Greek at the same time with one hand or the other, which is obviously an amazing sort of ability to have.
So the book we took that from is called Crete and James,
Yeah.
edited by John Shaw, and it was published by Michigan State University Press, 1984. It helps when other people do the work for you.
Well, the other thing though, which is so amazing, is that Crete he should be so self-righteous because when Crete went to his graduation, she found his other girlfriend there as well, and he afterwards he often went and visited this other woman, and he had other mistresses as well. So it was a kind of it wasn't open on her part, but they then lived apart for a while, and it was a strange marriage. They do say at the very end, when he became president for such a short time, that they were fairly happy in the White House, and then he was assassinated, and she did stay with him. I mean, she the whole time when he was didn't recover, and she actually was, I believe, the first president's wife to accumulate all the materials of his administration, everything she could find about his political career, and keep it together for what would be like a proto-presidential library, the first of its sort. So, but he was not a faithful guy, and his honesty was probably very hurtful. There's sometimes we perhaps rather not know.
I've interviewed a bunch of people over the years at Grover Cleveland, but I have to say that when I was reading the letter or letters you have in the book, it just felt a little strange because she was like 21, he was like 49, and I'm reading from his December 13th letter, 1885. While I love you, Frank, her name was Frances, he called her Frank, as dearly as I can, it pleases me very much to read about you, what you write about, your improvements and all that. I'm glad to believe that you appreciate something that is before you as the wife of the president and lady of the White House. What's your sense of their relationship? And it just seems odd that she was so young and he was much older.
Well,
I think
it's odder still in that she was the daughter of his late law partner, and when the law partner died, he became her guardian. So, and when that was when she was very young, and it wasn't until I guess she was a senior at Wells College that he certainly expressed his
I think
love.
there's something a little creepy about it. I mean, I won't go into it because it does seem a little creepy. That because I read in one source that actually Frankie's mother thought that she was going to be the one that might marry him. She did not realize until he proposed to her daughter that she was the one, because the age difference, the fact he'd given her her first sled, he'd known her since she was a baby, so there is something a little bit creepy about it. But interestingly, they are one of I don't know whether they're the only one, but I haven't read any other couple who actually didn't live in the White House. They bought a house or they rented a house in Washington, and they lived there, which I don't know about any other couple doing that.
They valued their privacy.
They
We
actually
know
value.
that.
Well, I guess they
After
did.
they were married, they were constantly dodging reporters and people that wanted to know. Reporters asked caterers what they were eating, so on and so
Oh,
forth.
well, that was for the honeymoon. Yes, they
Yeah.
followed them. But I think it was also the beginning of a press that was much more aggressive, and she became a celebrity because she was so young, and so people copied her styles and stuff like that. It was more modern because the media industry was bigger at that time. People wanted to find out about her.
At the end
Besides
of
that,
I just going to say at the end of this particular letter, Grover Cleveland writes, "Write me all the time, darling, and tell me just exactly how much you love me, and if you love me better and better or less and less."
yeah, I know.
I read that
I
primarily because I read a lot of that in these letters. Write me and tell me how much you love me.
yeah.
What did you find in that? What was your
I
reaction to
found that too, but I found it particularly in him. I thought there was something. First of all, there's the craziness that, after all, he is the only president that when he ran for office, it was "Ma, Ma, where's my pa?" gone to the White House, ha, 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 because he'd already been accused of having the illegitimate child when he was a younger man. So that there was that, which started out with, I don't know. I think. I think there was just something very peculiar about the neediness of some of the men, but I noticed the neediness in the case of LBJ actually ended once he got his what he wanted, because after that it was very clear he told her what he expected from her, and then it shifted the relationship over.
And they were very peremptory sorts of things. He wanted her to put pens in a certain pocket in his coat jacket, and when they were with another couple, he pointed out that she had a run in her stocking, wasn't
Yeah,
it?
he was not, no, but
And demanded that she leave the room and change her stockings. We got that from what's his name?
Robert Caro.
Robert
Well,
Caro.
I'm looking at that page, and I'll read some more that you wrote. You wrote this. Robert Carroll told his new Lyndon told his new bride he wanted her to serve him coffee in bed, along with a newspaper. She also had to lay out his clothes, fill his fountain pen and cigarette lighter, put them along with his handkerchief and money into the proper pocket of his suit, and finally shine his shoes. Did you either one of you have any reaction to hearing that about LBJ?
Oh, well, we asked about why she put up with so much from him because he also bragged about all his mistresses and that. But his thing, as we say here, that he said, that she loved him. When she was publicly asked, I think this was, well after LBJ was dead, was asked by a reporter why she wasn't more upset by all of these things that Lyndon did. Was she said Lyndon loved humanity. And she said half of humanity is females, and he loved women too. So that was sort of an odd out for a woman, but that was her
Yeah,
way
and
of
she
dealing
said
with it.
there's no way I could keep him from, but she says I know. She ended that he loves
He's the
me.
best, yeah.
Yeah,
I think he always knew her value. That's a different thing, but I don't think there's any doubt about that. She was very important to him, not only money wise, but she was organized. She did an awful lot of things for him, and he did appreciate that.
Tom, where did you grow up and go to school?
I grew up in Cincinnati, Ohio, and went to St. Xavier High School, and then I went and graduated from the University of Notre Dame, and I began to teach school, and since the school offered extra pay to people who had a master's degree, I went to Xavier University in Cincinnati and got a master's degree.
Where'd you go after that?
I came to New York to be a writer.
Where did you work at when you first got there?
Oh, I think, well, let's see, wasn't that the trade magazine called Discount Merchandiser, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, getting work as a writer, you take all sorts of things. Although I learned a lot from the people who were there. I used to write in longhand when I wrote my articles and stories, and the editor saw that and he said, "No, no," he says, "learn to type it out. Type it out. Don't write it longhand and then copy it."
Wait,
So,
was that a good idea?
yeah. Do I think it's a good idea?
Yeah.
Well, I learned to do it. It's faster, I guess. I don't know. Um, I think I still do some
You still write some things out in the beginning,
longhand.
yeah.
Yeah. Oh.
What
Yeah.
about your background, Dorothy?
Well, I grew up in Yonkers, New York, and went to Wells College, and I got a master's degree at NYU, and was lucky enough to live in New York in the '60s, which was fabulous, and met Tom, and been in New York ever since. So I really have never been outside a very small ambit.
How long have you two been married?
Well, what, 50,
Just slightly, we passed
52,
50 years. Yeah,
52 years.
50 years.
How much
50.
did each of you know or think you knew about presidents before you started this project?
Oh, Dorothy knows a lot. Any history topic,
No,
Dorothy
no.
knows.
Actually, when I was at Wells, I was very fortunate. Harry Truman was then, of course, an old man and no longer president, but he was giving talks all around the country on the presidency. And one of the places he was speaking was at Cornell. So I got to hear him. And actually, a friend and I, because we got all mixed up, it's a very, very big hall it was in. And we were walking down the hall and we almost bumped into Truman because he was coming one way, we were coming the opposite way. And because of course must have been 1960 or 61. Um, the there was no there were obviously must have been Secret Service, but they weren't all over the place. We just sort of walked to the side in that, but it was very exciting, getting so close and seeing somebody like that. So, yeah.
The Tafts are the premier Cincinnati political family, and so I knew, was always reading in the paper about what, not just William Howard Taft, but his children as well.
Robert Taft.
Robert Taft was a senator, and there's another Taft
His,
who was mayor of Cincinnati.
Well, back to this is another showstopper page for me, page 26 in your book, and the title on it is Abraham Lincoln to Eliza Browning, Mrs. Orville H. Can you explain what this particular section's about?
Yeah, it's long. I thought people would make more of this because we found the letters in the collected works of Abraham Lincoln. But I had never heard this story, and here are these letters, which seem to be indicate that he was pledged to marry somebody else, sort of sight unseen. Well, no, not sight unseen. He thought he knew what she looked like, and a friend of his, a woman, said, "I'm bringing my sister to Springfield, and she's looking for a husband." And he said, "Oh, well, I'm looking for a wife." So anyway, according to this one letter, there are three of these letters, two of which we quote. Excuse me. He, when she showed up, she wasn't what he expected at all. He said something, compared her to Falstaff. And so he started telling her how terrible a place Springfield was to live, blah, 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 and she wouldn't like it there. The weather was bad, this was bad. And so she backed out. Now, but the other letter describes that would-be courtship in a different light. He tells a friend of his, another friend of his, that he proposed to her, but she turned him down. He doesn't give the story that we learned from another of the letters, but they're printed. I mean, scholarly work here, in the collected works of Abraham Lincoln. There was something else in that whole sequence there. He was engaged to marry Todd, and in fact, he called it off because, as he evidently told nobody else but his law partner, that he thought he had syphilis. He had patronized a prostitute, and he didn't want to give her the syphilis. So a couple of years went by, and he decided, he took some medicine, whatever kind of medicine they took for syphilis in those days, and decided that he didn't have it, so they re-engaged. And the funny story on that is that he was getting dressed on the wedding day, and a friend of Mary Todd's dropped by with her two children. Evidently, at least if you read between the lines, she was there to see that this time he did show up. And her little boy, I think he said he was 6, said, where are you going, Mr. Lincoln? And he's said to have replied, "To hell, I suppose." So he wasn't, and by all accounts, it wasn't a terribly good husband. He was a good father, but you wouldn't want to necessarily have been married to him. He was kind of cold and unfeeling in many ways.
Dorothy, go to page 26 in your book. I want you to read part of that letter. Again, as Tom set it up, he was right.
Which, I'm sorry.
26, page 26.
Hmm.
This is the Abraham Lincoln to Eliza
Yeah.
Browning.
Hmm.
And the reason I want he's describing what he saw in that woman that he was supposedly going to marry as set up by the friend. I know this is complicated for somebody who can't see this. They can go out and buy your book and get the whole thing. But
Yeah.
go down there where this woman was supposedly 5'5", 150
Yes. Okay.
pounds, and
Yes.
start reading
Yeah.
right after that. I
Okay,
knew.
in a few days we had an interview, and although I had seen her before, she did not look as my imagination had pictured her. I knew she was oversized, but she now appeared a fair match for Falstaff. She was reportedly, 5'5", 150 pounds. I know she was called an old maid, and I felt no doubt of at least half of the appellation, but now, when I beheld her, I could not for my life avoid thinking of my mother, and this, not from withered features, for her skin was too full of fat to permit its contracting and wrinkles, but from her want of teeth, weather-bitten appearance in general, and from a kind of notion that ran in my head that nothing could have commenced at the size of infancy and reached her present bulk in less than 35 or 40 years. And in short, I was not pleased at all with her. Now that is bizarre because we always hear about how devoted he was to his mother, because it shows certainly some problems with women that that are obscure. He was definitely not a good husband. I always felt more sorry for Mary Todd than most people because I don't think he was a husband who had any, you know, a lot of presidents, it seems to me, were particularly ones who were quite good politicians. They related to masses of people well, but some of them privately were not very nice people or were cold. Uh, for intimate things, and I think that was true of Lincoln. I think he had mixed feelings about women, but I had always learned, again, when I grew up, we heard all these stories about him and his mother, how he loved his mother, blah blah. But this seems to indicate some rather negative
People.
feelings here too. So obviously, I mean, some people have claimed that he really was gay, but some of that that probably may be that he's just bisexual or that he was mixed up, as many people are, in sexuality of different sorts. But he was a cold person to his wife.
Well, in
I
that
think.
in that same letter, I just read one line because supposedly he had promised 3 years earlier that he would take this woman or as his wife if she came to him. He just says, "I was now fairly convinced that no other man on earth would have her, and hence the conclusion that they were bent on holding me to my bargain. Well, thought I have said, and it shall not be my fault if I fail to do it." Uh, Abraham,
And she did get married, and she did get married. So it's a weird story. I was not in favor of putting it particularly in the book, but Tom said he thought it was interesting, and he's right. It's a poser. It's a poser of what this is all about because you don't have the total story because you have fragments of it from different points of view. But it doesn't make him look good.
I might as well ask this question. I'm sure you've been asking before, but both of you, what was either your favorite letter or favorite series of letters?
Well, I always
Oh, Truman. Truman.
yours is the
I
Truman.
like Truman's letter. I mean, who wouldn't?
Truman was another one.
Loved his wife.
He wrote her from the time he was able to write, really, because he fell in love with her. He often said when they were in Sunday school together, and she was only 5 years old, and her family was wealthier by far, evidently, than his, and she was possibly looking for somebody a little more. But so he's constantly stressed that he could earn money and what he was doing to make money, what kind of schemes he was into.
Well, she came from the wealthiest family in the neighborhood. In fact, one of the interesting, I think, is a generalization, is that more men that became presidents married up. Most of them tended to marry up. Even Washington married the wealthiest widow. John Adams was um, Abigail's family he was a minister. They thought a farmer wasn't in the same kind of category. Many of the presidents came from lower class families than their wives. It's almost like maybe this first step of being ambitious, because they gained something from it.
Well, then, page 70, there's a letter that's dated June 22nd, 1911, Grandview, Missouri, or Missouri, depending on how you pronounce it.
Oh, yes, this is a wonderful one, yes.
But before you can read some of it, I think it would be useful. But he sounds like he had a terrible inferiority complex.
Yes, yes.
Read.
Well, I think it.
Go ahead. But read a little bit of it so you can get the feeling of what
Okay,
you're saying.
you just sort of need the beginning portion to give you the Dear Bessie. He begins with a reference to the drought that was then affecting the farmers of Missouri. From all appearances, I'm not a very pious person, am I? And goes on. Anyway, speaking of, here we go. Would you wear a It's an introduction to his first proposal to Bess. Would you wear a solitaire on your left hand? Should I get it? Now that it is a rather personal or pointed question, provided you take it for all means. You know, were I an Italian or a poet, I would commence and use all the luscious language of two continents. I'm not either, but only a kind of good-for-nothing American farmer. I've always had a sneaking notion that someday maybe I'd amount to something. I doubt it now, though. Like everything, it's a family failing of ours to be poor financiers. I'm blessed that way. Still, that doesn't keep me from having always thought that you were all that a girl could be possibly and impossibly. You may not have guessed it, but I've been crazy about you ever since we went to Sunday school together. But I never had the nerve to think you'd even look at me. I don't think so now, but I can't keep from telling you what I think of you. Still, if you turn me down, I'll not be thoroughly disappointed, for it's no more than I expect. Please write as soon as you feel that way. The sooner the better, the pleased I am. More than sincerely, Harry. I agree with you. There's a certain hangdog quality to a lot of these letters, which may have both turned her off and been fascinated by it.
Well, persistence in his case may have played a role because he just kept at it. This was even over a longer period than LBJ.
Oh, LBJ was short. They got married in it was only about 3 or 4 months. This went on for years. I guess she just didn't. She had her problems too because she never got over the fact her father had committed suicide. This is Bess Truman, and that suicide was a source of shame. So she was one of the reasons she always remained as far in the background as possible. She never wanted to become the subject of scandal, for this to come out. This was something that the whole family shared as a mark of a stigma.
In that next letter, he starts off by saying, Dear Bessie, you know that you turned me down so easy that I'm almost happy anyway. I never was fool enough to think that a girl like you could ever care for a fellow like me, but I couldn't help telling you how I felt.
Yeah.
What?
Yeah, that is unusual, and that he could then become a president. So he had a different ego strength or whatever. Of course, I don't know. I thought another interesting thing, letter of his was, and he writes to Bess, and he's talking about FDR right after he's been named as the vice president. And he talks about going to the White House for this meal and how he meets FDR, and FDR, he has to explain why his wife isn't there, and FDR says, "Oh, that's fine." And then at the end of the meeting, FDR says to him, he said, with Eleanor, when I first met her, this is paraphrasing, she was very shy. She didn't speak much at all. He said, now I can't keep her from stop talking. So this was 1944. So this was FDR speaking sort of off the record on Eleanor, that she got on his nerves from the constant talking. I thought it was just a little interesting thing that came out.
There were 4 or 5 times when there was some kind of a letter or a comment from a woman, a wife, but mostly there are no answers to any of these letters. Was that on purpose?
Yes, because we didn't have the answers and they thought it was better to just have it one way. Were very few times. There was Jane Pierce because her letters were more interesting than his.
When I read
Right
that
to the,
Jane Pierce spent most of her time as First Lady writing letters to her dead son, I thought I have to find one of these letters. And fortunately, we were able to, and it's pretty much as you expected.
well, we do have a retort from Abigail on one of the letters from John, but it's just a
Right.
portion of it.
That's one of the most famous letters
No,
in
no, that was
American
another
history.
one. It was another one of his too.
Oh, another.
Yeah, where she comments that you shouldn't be talking about women's legs.
Oh, yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, but
But she also had that letter that said,
oh, about the
um,
remember the ladies.
remember when you draw up the laws for your new government, remember the ladies. That's how it
The
begins.
declaration,
Go
yeah.
back, and we're getting down on the end of the conversation. But go back to the Jane Pierce thing because on page 197, you publish what
Age, what
she's
was that? I'm sorry.
97.
197. You
197.
published the letter that she wrote to her son Benny, who had been killed in the train accident as they were on their way to the inaugural when
Yes.
Franklin
Oh, that's
Pierce.
so.
Yeah, why don't you read a little bit of that? And she had lost three of her children by then. One at
All
3 months,
three.
one at
She
three
lost
years.
all three of her
Yeah.
children.
Read a little bit of that so we can get the flavor of it.
Okay, do you want to read it?
Which one?
Okay, it starts, My precious child, I must write to you, although you are never, you can read the next page, you are never
To see
see
it
it.
or know it.
How I long to see you and say something to you as if you were as you always have been. Oh, how precious do those days now seem, my darling boy. And how, go on, you can,
I should have prized the days past with you had I suspected that it might be so short. I know now, I know not how to go on without you. You were my comfort, dearest, far more than you know, thought. And oh, my precious boy, how gladly would I recall all that was unreasonable or hasty or mistaken in my conduct toward you. I see surely, and I did frequently afterward, that I had wronged you. Do you want me to continue? I mean, that's the tone.
and I, no, it's, I think it's good to just go a little further.
Okay. I see surely, and I did frequently afterward, that I had wronged you, and would gladly have acknowledged it, only that I feared it might weaken your confidence in me. And oh, to look around and see your books and everything so connected with your own dear self, and now on the Sabbath, which you loved so much, as you said so often. And oh, to think of you kneeling by me at our evening prayer tonight, dear child. How has not the Savior made you his,
Oh,
as we so often ask? But now I must kneel alone and beg for strength and support under this crushing sorrow.
okay.
Right?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's really, when you think about it, it's really horrifying because the woman was hysterical before this happened with Benji, and she blamed her husband's ambition because she actually did pray that he not become president, and that she thought that had this not happened, of course, they wouldn't have been on that train, and that maybe that Benji wouldn't have died. And of course, she saw the body. It must have been a horrific thing. I mean, some experts said that his head was, but whatever, it was a ghastly sight. And she saw it, and she never recovered from it. One of the people who was sympathetic to her and spent a lot of time in the White House was Nathaniel Hawthorne, who was a schoolmate of her husband. And I thought it was really gripping. I felt all my sympathy actually was with her.
Her
She, of
husband,
course, did not go to the inauguration.
yeah, but her husband did show his own feelings because he was one of maybe the only president not to swear on the
Bible.
Bible to follow the laws of the United States.
Yeah, I didn't use the Bible because he'd lost faith as a result of that.
He affirmed,
He affirmed,
is
yes,
what the term was.
but he didn't use a Bible.
As we wrap it up, go back to a comment you made earlier that this is your biggest success in your book writing career.
Oh, yes, definitely.
How do you
Yeah.
know? How do you at this point? How do you know that?
Well, no, I don't know whether it is, but I mean, I think so because it got more publicity than any other of the books that we'd done, and so this
What do we
They
get? 3 or 4 mentions in the New York Times.
Well, anyway, but I'm just saying it
No,
definitely
that
no, but it's just it's hope. Maybe it's hopeful thinking.
wishful.
Maybe
But do you,
wishful.
I mean, did you think when you did this it was going to be that successful?
We think that with every book.
No, that's not true. Do not. That's absolutely not true. I thought it might be because Simon and Schuster was the editor at Simon and Schuster was very enthusiastic about it. She had originally been working for the Miami Herald. I think she'd been an editor there, and she was very encouraging, and they did real work and publicizing it. I'm sure you know about the book industry, and you know that not every book gets any kind of attention. So most go out as orphans, and this didn't. So,
Do you happen to know how many letters are in the book?
oh God, I don't know how many. It was 100 and
Oh, I don't know.
it's embarrassing.
No.
We tried to get as many presidents in as we could, because obviously even though we could have gotten some more really great letters from some of the same people, we thought it was interesting. I thought some of the Grant letters were very, very interesting, and even the Rutherford B. Hayes ones were quite interesting as well. And I thought it was interesting. Oh, and the Tyler letters were quite good, I thought, as well. And it was very interesting that his grandson is still alive as of last week. I keep checking.
Yeah,
Imagine that he's a grandson alive.
we've had him on a lot over the years. But listen, thank you both. We're out of time, and this book is called Are You Prepared for the Storm of Lovemaking? Letters of Love and Lust from the White House, Dorothy and Thomas Hoobler. Thank you so much.
Well,
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for listening to the Booknotes Plus podcast. Please rate and review Booknotes Plus, and don't forget to follow so you never miss an episode. Questions or comments, we would love to hear from you. You can email us at podcasts@c-span.org.